everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hajra Kartia, and I'm a diversity peer educator at the Multicultural Center, and I will be your co-host today. I would like to welcome and thank Ms. Jacqueline Prince. She is the Assistant Director of Women's and Gender Equity Program in the Gender Center at obviously UTD, but has been challenging the patriarchy since she and I guess her first grade teacher can remember. In this role, Jacqueline has worked through the lens of intersection feminists to education, educate, and provide programs for the UTD community. Jacqueline specializes in helping her community learn about the economic empowerment of women and gender minorities, gender and racial inequality, and how to maximize their privilege to advocate for and with others. As a lifelong learner, Jacqueline has experience with both privilege and oppression, so she deeply values hearing others' stories and experiences. Feel free to contact her through her email. You can share your stories, discuss liberation, the gender pay gap, inclusive dress codes to your heart's content. I will put out her email in our chat and you can easily access it there. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask then. Thank you for joining us again, Jacqueline. Um, Here we go. We welcome her now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hajra, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. As shared, my name is Jacqueline Prince. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am thrilled to be having this conversation with you all today. And so is my colleague here, baby Quinn. All right. Continuing on. So as Clarissa already shared some community expectations, just really wanting to commit to those as we share space together today. And as we talk about this topic, it feels like the best way to kind of give ourselves a foundation for this is to talk about it with the lens of feminism or feminisms, as we'll see here. So, just acknowledging that there's not just one, there are the potential for many. And I would love to hear again from the group. What does feminism mean to you? What is your experiences or knowledge base? What have you heard about feminism? And again, you can kind of sound off in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and kind of jump into the conversation. I see something coming up in the chat. Feminism is the collective effort to achieve liberation by dismantling or eliminating the patriarchy and associated and interrelated systems of privilege and oppression. Ooh, and then examples: racism, ableism, cis heteronormativity, etc. I am so here for this description. I love that. And then someone else has shared that maybe why they have joined us today is that they're always seeking to learn more about how to effectively challenge gender norms, roles, and expectations, and of course, how to be a feminist leader. So I love all of it. Just beautifully put, everyone. I think we've gotten baby Quinn excited as well. So I think the best way for us to kind of begin setting this foundation is to have some common language in how we talk about these things. And so the first thing that I hear from folks is some questions around when we use gender equity versus talking about gender equality or equality in general. And so I'm wondering if other folks have heard this as well, or maybe have more commonly used them interchangeably. I feel curious about that. So anyone who'd like to jump in and maybe reflect on that as well, I'd love to hear from you. Oh, great comment in the chat too. It said feminism means working towards achieving global gender equality. Everyone is born equal regardless of gender, race, or sexuality. Love it. Yes. we can jump to this definition that we use to talk about gender equity. It's the pursuit of justice through fair access to resources, meaning there are equitable opportunities to support individuals or groups who have been marginalized and historically denied access to resources. So we like this definition, and we like to use gender equity versus equality because equality means that there is just a really homogenous approach. It's the same for everyone rather than something that may fit someone's specific needs. This just seems to have a more inclusive and, again, equitable outcome when we strive towards equity. The other common, I guess, challenge around language that I find is, people using the word female or male versus woman or femme or men or mask people. And so I'm wondering, again, looking to the chat, if people have, seen that used interchangeably, or if you've heard kind of a difference explained between the two. Yes. Oh my gosh, something wonderful came through the chat. Um, Actually, several wonderful things have come through the chat. Female is more commonly used for sex assigned at birth, and woman is more for gender identity, femme for gender expression. Absolutely. Um, I think this is just perfectly phrased, participant. Uh, Absolutely. Why would we, I think that you've also outlined why we would try to be as intentional as possible when we use these different words. I have heard pretty frequently people use them interchangeably, but as this participant beautifully outlined, we can oversimplify and possibly do harm when we collapse those things on top of each other. Just using myself as an example, my sex assigned at birth was female. And as I grew into my personhood, I was like, yeah, I do vibe with being a woman. That is a part of, that aligns with my gender identity. Absolutely. And so that would mean that I am a cisgender woman. Now, when you have someone who's sex assigned at birth doesn't align in that way, and later on down the line, they're like, nope. This gender identity doesn't vibe with me, and I identify in a different way. You can see why when we collapse female or male on top of, and we make assumptions about, men or women or beyond, that that it can become, we oversimplify, like I said, and potentially even do harm. So I like to be very clear about when I'm using those terms. And frankly, this may be a little bit controversial, but I frequently in my work, other than describing things and definitions and things like that, I do not frequently see a need to talk about sex assigned at birth. When I'm programming or talking to people, or people are sharing who they are with me, we're really sharing in terms of gender expression and gender identity. We're talking about how we best express ourselves. We're talking about pronouns and things like that. And so I rarely, those who know me will probably rarely hear me say the word female in reference to myself or others. So just feel like those are some important points for us to outline. Now, I am curious to hear what we've heard about sexism and misogyny. Those are two terms that I think we are finding more and more commonly in our language and in the larger discourse for people. And I think that the sexism and misogyny are oftentimes um, two words that get collapsed on each other as well. The way that I like to separate them out is by talking about sexism as the vehicle and misogyny as the fuel for the vehicle. So, misogyny, just simply put, and this is included in the resource that I shared in the chat. And so you can see that on one of the pages there that there are some actual definitions for these words. So if you're really curious and wanting to do some reflection on the differences for you and maybe thinking about examples for yourself, you can look at those definitions. But misogyny is just generally speaking a, oh my goodness, so we were just talking about sexism and misogyny and the differences between the two and kind of what they meant. So misogyny meaning the just general hatred of women. Now, that would be the fuel that helps the sexism vehicle go, essentially. So, sexism is the pervasive ways in which women and femme people are systemically and pervasively discriminated against or otherwise belittled or devalued in our everyday lives and like I said, systemically as well. So just giving you a brief example of how sexism comes up is in doing medical studies. Oftentimes the information that we have about our physical health, those studies were done on cis white men of average size, build, and holding non-disabled identities, and those results are then shared and expected for everyone. So some of the results that we have about like heart disease or I know it's exhausting just thinking about all this sexism. Um, the ways in which they test vehicles. It's only been recently that they use, the dummy figures in different sizes to capture safety for different body sizes and types. So you can think about different examples. I mean, I just used two that have direct negative health implications on well, on literally everyone, but it can specifically marginalize women and femme people. So there's that example. There are some others that fall under these umbrellas that feel important to talk about and make sure that we reference and that we understand. Underneath the umbrella of misogyny, there are some other ways in which people are specifically harmed or otherwise ostracized or discriminated against in society. Misogynoir is a phrase that, or is a word that references the specific ways in which Black women and femme people are harmed and discriminated against. Transmisogyny is the specific ways in which trans women and femme people are harmed and discriminated against. And then something that I found to be very powerful to talk about, because unfortunately, when I talk about these things, there's the assumption that I'm talking about men doing these things. And so I like to talk about the term internalized misogyny, because we are all capable and may frequently either subconsciously or consciously do some of these things. And so we've internalized, I know it's also exhausting, we've internalized some of this hatred or, like I said, harm and discrimination. So those are just some terms that I would really encourage folks to familiarize themselves with, because they can be really helpful when you are thinking about these topics and how they may directly affect you or those you care about, and are advocating for. So I just really love a good tweet, as many who know me know. And the feminist next door shares, plenty of misogynists are kind to their girlfriends, wives, and mothers. Misogyny isn't about hating every woman, it's about hating the ones who step out of line. I really love this explanation because I think it, again, it goes to really highlight that, again, it's not necessarily something that you may be able to pinpoint or point a finger at. It could be something that, again, is pervasive, that is unspoken, that we see more in actions rather than someone sharing explicitly, I hate women. That's typically not how it happens. I do want to check in on some of the things that have come into the chat because, again, wonderful stuff. I think really great comments have been made in regard to what we were talking about with sex versus gender identity. So thank you so much for that labor, y'all. Sexist actions by women are less likely to be identified and called out as sexist. Oh my goodness. I love and appreciate that highlight because that's absolutely something that we see present quite a bit. I've actually heard some folks saying, I didn't realize that that was sexist. I mean, I am a woman, so and what I like to say is that we all are fed a steady diet of patriarchy and white supremacy as we grow up, and so to think that we might be immune to some of these ideas that we absorb at really young ages just feels really unrealistic. So some other vocabulary to be aware of is, because we're talking about types of feminism, is womanism and transfeminism. So womanism is a movement in theory that really came up in response to the specific racial and gender oppression of Black women. We see historically there are multiple moments in time that Black women have aided in civil rights movements and still been incredibly ostracized and silenced and then erased from the efforts of that movement. And so, Alice Walker, who really coined this term, you know, wanted to name this specific erasure and oppression and be more specific about the positionality that she and others similar to her were experiencing. And similarly, transfeminism, that was really a movement coming out of the trans community by and for trans women, viewing their liberation to be intrinsically linked to the liberation of all women and beyond. I think that is another kind of that's another example of ways in which maybe feminism as a whole or as an umbrella has not done a good job of not just including people, but also like erasing people and potentially causing harm to others, just being really problematic in those ways. So just checking in with the chat again. Um, Yes, I see there's a really great um, link or excuse me, not link, but reference to further reading. So I love it. I love further resources. So thank you. So another type of feminism is intersectionality. I'm wondering maybe folks in the chat and others might be able to jump in and share what you've heard about intersectionality, what you may know about it, understand about it, etc. what I have here is if feminism is advocating for women's rights and equality between the sexes, intersectional feminism is understanding how women's overlapping identities, including race, class, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and disability status, impact the way they experience oppression and discrimination. It feels important to distinguish that this this theoretical framework is a legal theoretical framework. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in the late 80s, used it as uh, a term to use in a particular case that she was making on behalf of a Black woman who was trying to advocate for herself and the discrimination she faced in her office. And so people were, trying to make the case that no, women in the office are just fine. We have really high employee satisfaction in the office from the women. And they were saying, I know, buddy. They were also saying that well, and look at Black folks in the office, really high levels of employee satisfaction from Black folks in our office. And what they found was that when they talked about Black individuals in their office, they were talking about Black men. When they talked about the women in the office, they were talking about white women. It was very few examples. She was really the only person as a Black woman who was experiencing that kind of dual oppression. And so this word, this theoretical framework is meant to capture that. And we have dropped a binky. So I'm going to pause for a moment, maybe while you all share your thoughts on that, or maybe what you've heard about it in the chat.
So we do have someone in the chat who also left a comment that stated, talking about intersectionality. So intersectionality is a way I primarily look at feminism because women are not free until all women are free, and that patriarchy does not stand alone. Other structures of oppression support it and contribute to its functioning. So I really appreciate that as well, because when we look at intersectionality, there are many pieces to every individual person, and all those individual pieces are also in other people. So to me, I guess going back to that comment as well, is we are all a community. We're all together as we go through this and fight for things, whether it be politically, policy wise, or even in like work environments, to help those structures be less oppressive.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I love that comment. I also really appreciate your perspective and take on it, Clarissa. That just that is spot on. Absolutely. Let's look at an example. So some of you may have known or heard about um, uh, in 2020. It was a very packed year, so I will be specific. Many people were wanting to celebrate it being 100 years since the 19th Amendment was ratified, which granted women the right to vote. And so many people, in talking about that and advertising it and just wanting to celebrate, were saying, it's been 100 years. Can you believe it? Just really being joyful, which is understandable about that fact. However, when we look at some of the details, the fine print, again, referencing back to the erasure I was talking about, we know that white landowning women were granted the right to vote. When we look at some of those details, Asian American women couldn't vote until just 68 years ago. Native American women or indigenous women, it was 58 years ago. And then Black women and other women of color couldn't vote until 55 years ago. So looking towards the Civil Rights Act. And so again, people may feel like, oh, there's some distance put in between us and that. false. Even now, we have U.S. citizens who are not able to vote in certain elections, so in the presidential election. So when we talk about ways in which certain people are disadvantaged or are marginalized, this is kind of what we're talking about. So when you may hear about certain things like this, oh, wow, it's been 100 years since the 19th Amendment. That's amazing. Just knowing that while that may be celebratory for some folks, for others hearing that, they were like, well, it was like 50 more years for me, and why that might be complicated for some other folks. So going over a brief history of the different waves of feminism, y'all, just so you know, this is the briefest of histories because going over the 4 waves is a class. Like going over one wave of feminism or that time period is an entire class. So I know that I am just doing this very briefly, but there are you may have heard in talking about feminism that there are 4 waves to it, and they align with history. So there's a bit of a timeline feeling to it, but there's also a mindset that goes along with it. So you may hear people reference different waves of feminism to reference the time period. You also may hear people reference a wave of feminism to describe a way of thinking. So just going through them, the first wave of feminism, the period of feminist activity was really around the 19th and early 20th century and focused on legal issues. So primarily women's suffrage, so the right to vote. That's what you'll see a lot of. It's not that, well, yeah, again, trying to keep it brief, going into the second wave of feminism, that period of activity can really be marked by like the early 60s in the US. And again, I'm sharing these waves with a US perspective. So I want to be clear that there was feminist activity going on internationally, but our focus in this brief really collapsed history is from a U.S. perspective. Um, so we're talking about the 1960s in the U.S. and the movement lasted to the 80s. A lot of this was focused on sexual liberation, and there was probably more crossover in the second wave of civil rights in regard to race than in the previous wave. In the previous wave, talking about the suffragist movement, there were Black, Indigenous, Asian, women of many different races and racial backgrounds involved in those movements, but you will rarely see their names mentioned. There's a lot of erasure that happened, and quite literally, when people talk about the March on Seneca Falls, what gets left out of the story is how it was decided. There was actually like a big disagreement as to if Black women would be able to join them in that march. And so what they came to was that they would be able to march with them, but in the back. So people who were doing so much work and assisting in this movement were not even given the honor and just credit of being able to march along. So the second wave did a better job in recognition of looking at how race and gender intersected. The third wave focused on, well, many things, but trying to abolish gender role stereotypes. So you're seeing so many more women in the workforce. And so I could talk about that for an entire day, right? Because if you're really focusing in on when women entered the workforce, it was bits and pieces throughout the early 19th century, in 20th century, but it really didn't happen in larger numbers until the 80s and early 90s. So when we think about women's place in the workforce, it's been just such a short amount of time that's been able to happen. And so again, breezing through all of this, the fourth wave, many have different discussions or thoughts on when this might have happened, but we believe that it is marked by around like 2012 or so, and really having an association with social media. Social media allowed a platform to people who typically did not have a platform, that their voices, like I said before, were completely erased. Example given, in the Me Too movement, many people at first associated the Me Too movement and credited the actress Alyssa Milano with that hashtag of Me Too, and talking about her experiences in Hollywood. But because of social media and the internets, we were able to pull up receipts and see that it was actually Tarana Burke who posted that several years before, and we were able to appropriately credit her with that. So y'all, again, the briefest of history in regard to the four waves of feminism. It just feels important to talk about what those are, and just an awareness that they exist. So if you hear people talking about them, you're like, oh, I have, kind of an awareness of what those are. So yeah, some notable feminist figures within them, because many people, frankly, hear about some of the white feminists that are just more commonly mentioned. Here you have some feminists of color associated with each wave. So just looking at these boxes, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, these were feminists who were doing work within the first wave, and who definitely made a huge impact and a great mark on history. Moving forward, second wave feminists, you can see in Angela Davis, Coretta Scott King, doing amazing work, Alice Walker, etc. Third wave, Audre Lorde. Many people I've noticed quote Audre Lorde, but may not be as familiar um, with her writings and with her actual work. And then you see fourth wave feminists, and you might notice that in each of the squares they get bigger and bigger, and more people were included. And I think that this just feels really important to note, that I think it has something to do with the platform that was allowed. So we talked quite a bit about just some of these overall concepts, who's been harmed, what things mean, and a really great question that I get asked frequently is feminism all about women? Or maybe people making the assumption that feminism is all about women, and it's not. Feminism doesn't necessarily mean just women or femme people. It actually is a movement, or talking about gender equity. What we talk about and focus in on the Gender Center is something that actually helps everyone, people regardless of what your gender identity is. There are direct benefits to men and mask people as well with this kind of work. And although I can think of several examples off the top of my head of that, and the interest of time and really wanting to make sure I get to your questions and great comments, I will move forward. So just thinking a little bit more about what effect this has on men, and just really wanting to piece that apart a little bit. The book that we read for our fall 2020 book club in the Gender Center. It was called For the Love of Men. It's a book written by Liz Plank, which, just as a side note, if you look at Liz Plank's work and some of her postings online, you will see men in masked people out in droves in her comment section, talking about, like, what are you doing writing about men? You're a woman. And just, I mean, a lot of toxic masculinity coming out and kind of proving some of her assertions. But one of the reasons why this book was incredibly impactful for myself, but also for other participants in the club, was that this way of talking about men and masculinity is something that I have never heard before this. And you can see the book was written in 2019. And I kind of viewed it as an absolute love letter to men. This is the first time that I'd ever heard anyone focus on the direct negative impacts that toxic masculinity has on men. I heard frequently, and as a part of my own education and training, etc., I heard all about, the harm, just physical, emotional, socioeconomical, just all of the harm that can come to women and femme people. But I just truly never heard how it harms men. And so I felt like this quote was really impactful in talking about researchers concluding that violating the toxic code of masculinity can be such a point of stress for men that it negatively impacts their overall health. And so, just expanding on that quote a little bit, she says, they and this is in reference to uh, a specific research study that they did, that found that men who earned less than their wives for an extended period of time experienced poorer health outcomes, shorter life expectancies, and more risk of cardiovascular problems like diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, hypertension, and stroke, which led the researchers to conclude that violating the toxic code of masculinity can be such a point of stress for men that it negatively impacts their overall health. Diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol. We're talking about real, real health maladies that are directly impacting men when they feel like they have violated these codes. And so I think when it becomes realistic like that, when we can see on paper that we're not just it's not just one gender that is harmed in this system, that it really is everyone. There's mental health issues. There's actually a link that she outlines with talking about how our unhoused neighbors are less likely to seek services and assistance, and will be unhoused for longer than girls and women. And it made sense to me as I was reading it, because I was thinking about all the resources that are available to women and children in regard to homelessness or being unhoused. So these are just some overall examples that feel really important to mention as we talk about who feminism is really advocating for, who gender equity is really focusing in on. And the answer is everyone. Everyone experiencing harm. We want to take a look at that harm and really examine some of these cultural choices to see how we can improve the lives of everyone. So, just looking at an example, improving the lives of everyone, the gender pay gap. So, some people have asked me, does this really exist? Is there really, are you really taking a look at different jobs? Because, some women just choose jobs that are not as high paying. The gender pay gap exists when there is no different factors between the research subjects. So when they did this research, it was based off of people who were in the same role for the same amount of time, the same level of education experience, just the same across the board. And when I have like UTD students in particular who will ask me that, with our focus on research and data, that would be such a irresponsible way of collecting data, right? As if we were like kind of picking all over the map, just focusing in on lower paid jobs and then higher paid jobs. That really wouldn't make sense. So when we talk about the gender pay gap, we are talking about all of this on the same level, and this just being a factor of gender inequity. So, do women really make 78 cents to a man's dollar? And that becomes complicated. So, there's a comment in the chat that's really, really powerful. The gender pay gap is exacerbated by racial inequity as well. Latina women, Black women, and Indigenous women make markedly less than even white women. Absolutely. So, I have this number here that people may, if they are familiar with the gender pay gap, they're more familiar with the number of 78 cents or 78%. And that is not the full story. Even when we talk about the racial differences, I think people get really uncomfortable to acknowledge that the actual gender pay gap is closer to 53% or 53 cents to a white man's dollar, because Latinx women will count to make 53 cents to a white man's dollar. So why would we be talking about the gap in that way? Well, the simple answer is that people have said, well, we're just doing, we're just doing an average of all of them together. We can see how harmful it is when we do an average, because you're talking about 53% versus and it differs a little bit based on study, but for Asian women 90%. So that's the average that they're using. Well, let's dig into that. Asian women, Asian as a racial umbrella is so diverse within itself. And so that also has really negative consequences when we collapse all of those identities together. You can see in this infographic that Indian women compared to white non-Hispanic men's earnings can make 118%. Whereas Burmese women are at 44%. That is incredibly harmful for us to then say, well, just, we can't include all of these identities. We can't include all of these countries. So we will just, come up with an average. That has direct harm to the most marginalized within this larger community. So we can see what happens, y'all, when we when we make certain assumptions, or we run the risk of further marginalizing certain groups. And so something I like to point out that you may have heard before referenced is that, diversity, and diversity being a wonderful, beautiful thing, and how, UTD is so diverse, and that's amazing. Diversity is a fact. That is just factually true. We have a very diverse campus in regard to racial identity, in regard to disability status, in regard to LGBT plus identities, just all kinds of diversity. That just is a fact because we exist collectively. The action would be working to include all of those identities. That is the really important next step. That's the action. We want to make sure that we are engaging in inclusion. Then hopefully that will lead to a feeling of belonging. So when we work to include people and include people successfully, effectively, it sows a sense of belonging in people. And so whereas we have diversity, that's a fact. We work through the action of working to include people, and then hopefully the outcome, the thing that we have to look forward to, the thing that I hope we strive for, is belonging. And so there's a quote here from Yasmin Cheyenne that says, if you have to give up any part of yourself to be included, then you don't actually belong there. That just felt like a really powerful phrase that I can think about, again, a bunch of different examples, even just for myself, of thinking, of times in which I've been pressured to quote unquote tone down my hair. That was they were diverse factually because I was present, but the action of inclusion was missing. And so the feeling of belonging was completely absent. And I did not last long in that space because I realized I didn't actually belong there. So hopefully you're able to kind of think about these concepts and apply them to your own workspace, home space, wherever it feels appropriate to connect this to. And I'm seeing here in the chat that this seems to really connect with a participant that said that's powerful yet also painful when I think of how many spaces I don't actually belong in. And I just didn't think I would get emotional, y'all, on a Thursday afternoon, but I really connect with that participant, and I'm holding that fact with you. And I hope that we in the Gender Center, our collab partners in the MC, can really work to help remove those barriers to that sense of belonging for you and for anyone else, because we deserve to be here. The second example that I have is just talking about emotional or domestic labor within an office space, and it can be a classroom space as well, if that's kind of what you're navigating, or a student organization. There's just some hidden labor that is really not thought about as labor or as leadership skills. And so some of the examples that I like to bring up about to describe this is birthday celebration planning. So what goes behind a birthday celebration? If in your environment, leadership has decided like, oh, this is really important, I think that people will feel that sense of belonging by us acknowledging their birthdays. What goes behind that? What goes behind that is maybe you get them a card. I really want us, I know I'm digging into the weeds in this example, but it feels important because this labor is hidden, that I want to uncover it. What goes into the card is you have to know a little bit about that person in order to come up with a card that actually like kind of vibes with who they are, and what they might connect with. So in addition to going and getting this card, you're thinking about this person, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, etc. Then you're needing to pass that card around to people that you think would that the receiver would appreciate having signed their card. And potentially leaving someone out can cause a lot of interpersonal issues. So you're wanting to hold all these things in your brain, and we've just talked about the card, not even anything else. So if you're wanting to celebrate through cupcakes or through a cake or some kind of beverage or pastry, etc., you'd have to know what they like. You'd have to go and purchase that. You'd have to be aware of all of the dietary restrictions, or just things to be aware of people's diets by knowing that to be able to purchase something. So all of these things are just sometimes expected, or they are, like I said, they are hidden. It's not really thought through of like, oh, these are all the steps that any given person who's responsible for celebrating, or for planning the celebration for someone, goes into. And I like to highlight that for many people, it is it falls to women and femme people, because it's assumed, oh, you're just good at that. This is just something that you are really good at. You make it look effortless. So yes, so you can do it. When in actuality, it's been a lifetime of those kinds of expectations on that person that has cultivated the skill for that person. And so you're actually looking at a lifetime of skill building that leads this person to make it look so effortless. And so I guess just bouncing back to how this harms men, and masculine people, when they're not asked to do these things, or when they're not uh, not expected to, or whatever, we are making the assumption that they're not good at this. We are potentially infantilizing them and their experiences and their talents and skills, etc. And the same goes for setting up or tearing down for events and meetings. That typically falls to women and femme people. Oh, because you think of everything. You're just really good at that. Note taking. Oh, that's not a skill of mine. Skills are built. There are definitely things that people may be naturally good at. I don't want to leave that space out for that, because that's definitely true. There are some things, like, I'm not naturally good at note taking myself, and so it's a skill that I've had to build over time. So I just wonder how many men and masculine people would be good at some of these things if we allowed them space, or are already good, but we're making assumptions that they're not, um, with some of these things. So just some examples to be aware of and to think about. And I want to check in with the chat again to see. Oh, what do you think is an appropriate way to navigate a space where inclusion is not practiced? How do you determine how much to be genuine, or how much to hide, change, how much to push back against inequity at the risk of losing a job? Oh my goodness, participant. Um, Such a important and ultimately challenging question, because it depends on the level of safety that you're experiencing in that space. If you are um, if you are at risk of losing that job, what does that mean? Does that mean that you no longer will have food on the table or a roof over your head? Would that jeopardize some of your most basic needs and necessities? Or do you have a little space, economic space to do that? Do you have the emotional space to do that? There's just a lot of almost like checklist questions that I would pose back to anyone who is thinking about that, and wanting to know how much to push, and also to be aware of the policies and procedures that are there to protect you, to kind of keep in the back of your mind, to remind the person that you are maybe challenging or providing an alternative perspective to. Really good question. I think we are over time. Oh my goodness. My apologies, Clarissa. Just really great comments in the chat, great questions, and hopefully some really great reflections from others.
But before we head out, I want to say thank you to all of you who took the time to come and registered for this event and added so much great dialogue and questions as well. Another thank you to the Gender Center and Jacqueline as well for sharing her knowledge with us today. Amazing, a great way for us to go ahead and just move on in and start celebrating Women's History Month.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Clarissa, for having me.